were unchanging and pristine. But Galileo's telescope continued to reveal a cosmos quite unlike the officially accepted truth. Even on the bright surface of the sun itself, Galileo observed dark blemishes which he named sunspots. He could not have known that the spots were actually magnetic storms, but his descriptions of them were remarkably accurate.
Sunspots are generated and decay in longer and shorter periods. Some condense and others greatly expand from day to day. They change their shapes, and some are most irregular. They must be enormous in bulk, being either on the sun or very close to it.
Galileo gets into an argument with a German Jesuit mathematician named Christoph Scheiner about the nature of sunspots. The German argues that these spots are in fact little satellites that go around the sun, whereas Galileo argues that these spots are really either on the surface of the sun or very close to it, and that they're sort of like perhaps clouds.
If the Jesuit were right, and the spots were independent satellites, then the surface of the sun would remain pristine, as doctrine demanded.
Sunspots have a very irregular appearance, and if you can bring that out visually, then the argument that these are satellites of the sun becomes absurd. And so Galileo very carefully planned the publication of his letters of sunspots. They're all oriented properly so that you can see them from one day to the next, being sort of born on the sun and dying there. All of a sudden, in the middle of the sun, appears on one day a little spot, and the next day it grows, and then it grows some more, and then it slowly goes off the edge. Clearly, there are spots on the sun that are so irregularly shaped that they can't possibly be satellites. There is a visual essay in which you have uninterrupted views of sunspots.
Galileo produced a series of intricate engravings recording the daily changes of his sunspots. The continuous movements of the blemishes suggested that the sun might actually rotate on its axis.
The visual evidence is accepted by both Copernicans and people who still believe that the Earth is the center of the universe. But it is the interpretation of that evidence. And more and more and more, you see these conservative astronomers then stretching. Because if you can say that these are satellites of the sun, you can still say that the sun is perfect.
Galileo knew that his adversaries were wrong. It didn't matter if the Jesuit mathematician wished the sun to be unblemished. Galileo had demonstrated real spots on the surface of the real sun. Seven years after the Inquisition banned Copernicus, news reached Galileo that a new pope had ascended the throne of St. Peter. The College of Cardinals had chosen a member of a prominent Tuscan family, a man Galileo actually considered a friend. Maffeo Barberini would become Pope Urban VIII.
Urban VIII is an interesting choice for a pope at that point. He's a member of the Barberini family, and the old joke was, what the barbarians didn't loot from Rome, the Barbarinis did.
His coat of arms, when he was a young prelate, had 3 horseflies, and horseflies became increasingly undignified for someone who's rising that far in the church. And so the horseflies at a certain point change into busy bees, and Maffeo Barberini therefore becomes the personification of a hard-working, productive individual.
Everything that you see that is a sign of the beautiful Renaissance Rome was either started, continued, or inspired by what Urban VIII had done.
At the bottom of the Via Veneto, you have a fountain with 3 Barberini bees reminding you which pope gave you this water fountain, and also reminding you that you shouldn't be just lounging around at the fountain. You should be making like the bee and producing honey.
The new pope was a great fan of Galileo, who had written poems to Galileo, and all of a sudden then the situation appeared very different from the way it did in 1616.
When news of Urban VIII's elevation reached her convent, Maria Celeste hoped that her father's silencing at the hands of the Church would be over. Galileo secretly shared a letter he received from his old friend, the Pope.
Father, the happiness I derived from the letter written to you by the Supreme Pontiff was indescribable. His note so clearly expresses the affection this great man has for you. I have read and reread it, savoring it in private, and here I return it to you as you insist, without having shown it to anyone.
Galileo made the difficult 2-week journey to Rome, especially to meet with Pope Urban VIII. The two old friends had a series of conversations as they strolled the paths of the Vatican.
The Pope and Galileo walked around in the Vatican gardens talking about various things, and of course one of the things they talked about was whether or not Galileo could publish on the Copernican theory. And the Pope told him that as long as he limited himself to speaking about it hypothetically, there would be no problem.
So as long as the Copernican view that the Earth moved around the Sun was presented only as a hypothesis, one theory among many, Urban VIII would allow it to be debated.
Galileo came away from these meetings feeling that this was the time to write his big book on cosmology, which he had been promising since 1610.
Now 60 years old, he threw himself into his new book. The Pope had given Galileo license to embark on what he hoped would be his most important work. Writing in Italian, not Latin, laying out his most persuasive evidence in a witty popular style, Galileo set out to entertain and win over everyone who read it to the Copernican worldview. Maria Celeste's letters suggest that her father permitted her to read his unfinished manuscript.
There seems to be a genuine interest on her part in his work. Of course, she's self-denigrating. She always says, I'd love to see what you're writing if you think I could understand it. And of course, I promise not to talk about it to anyone else. So they have an intimacy on the work level. And possibly the most interesting thing that comes out of the letters is this strong indication that when he's working on the dialogue, their back and forth starts to include something called cuttings, which are obviously pieces of a manuscript. And it seems that she is the one who's actually preparing the manuscript.
Months of writing stretched on as sickness interrupted his work. Finally, after 5 years, the end was in sight.
By the grace of God, I've got on the right path. The book will be quite large and full of novelties, which, by writing it in the manner of a dialogue, I can introduce without affectation or drudgery. If I can just survive this winter, I shall bring it to an end and publish it immediately.
Galileo finished his great book on Christmas Eve 1629. It was called Dialogue on the Two Chief Systems of the World.
It is a rhetorical masterpiece. Galileo explains the new view of the world. It is a debate about the world systems. Is the sun the center of the universe? Or is the earth the center of the universe? He brings forward all his wonderful discoveries with the telescope, and you just pull